Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. This is your one-stop shop to take stock of all the progress on the political and literal battlefields. Let's go ahead and get started. While President Volodymyr Zelenskyy continues to win support from world leaders in his continuing quest for military backing, there's been less positive news on the domestic front. According to a survey by Kiev International Institute of Sociology, half of Ukrainians believe that the president fulfilled few or none of his election promises during his 5 years in office.
Residents across Ukraine were asked for their views on President Zelenskyy's performance during his 5 years in office. Not good was the general feeling. In his campaign, Zelenskyy pledged to end the war in Donbas, fight corruption and improve the welfare of Ukrainians. According to a poll by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, 50% of respondents believe Zelenskyy has fulfilled few or none of these promises. The survey revealed that only 18% of voters think the president realised most or all of his commitments. But voters said Zelenskyy was not wholly to blame. Half of those questioned attributed his failures to the presence of dishonest and corrupt individuals within his team. There were other explanations for the unfulfilled promises too. 32% blamed a lack of competent people in Zelenskyy's team. 31% said the full-scale invasion presented too great a barrier. 27% cited his own inexperience, and 26% said the influence of oligarchs was to blame. Among Zelenskyy's successes, Ukrainians recognise his resilience in repelling Russian aggression and the international activities aimed at strengthening support for Ukraine in the war.
After passing the mobilization bill, and since June the 1st, new regulations have been introduced so that Ukraine no longer recognizes dual citizenship. These changes also make it so that dual citizens, in particular men aged between 18 and 60, are no longer allowed to travel outside the country.
Huge queues at the border with Poland as thousands flee Ukraine in the days after Russia's invasion. Now, more than 2 years on, Kyiv has tightened the regulations around leaving the country. The State Border Guard Service says Ukrainians who have residence permits in other countries and dual citizenship have lost the opportunity to leave the country. The move is mainly aimed at conscription-age men. A spokesman said they had previously allowed people who had a residence permit outside Ukraine to leave the country. Now, this is not permitted. At the same time, the US Embassy in Kyiv published a warning to citizens who also hold Ukrainian citizenship. A statement said Ukraine no longer recognizes the so-called stay-abroad status as an exception entitling Ukrainian men between the ages of 18 and 60 to leave the country during the war. The embassy says Americans with Ukrainian citizenship who are in Ukraine and cannot leave the country should take refuge and obey the law. Others are advised to refrain from travelling to Ukraine.
Ukrainians are facing the most severe electricity blackout since the invasion began following Russia's relentless campaign against the country's energy infrastructure. The Financial Times reports that Russia has captured or knocked out more than half of Ukraine's electrical generating capacity.
Workers survey the damage to their power plant after yet another attack. This facility and others like it have been in Russia's crosshairs since the start of the war, but attacks on power generation have intensified. They forced energy companies to impose nationwide shutdowns while scrambling to repair the damage and find alternative supplies. It's the same story here, absolute devastation. Before Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine's domestic energy production was about 55 gigawatts of electricity, among the largest in Europe. 6 reactors at the Zaporizhzhia plant held by Russia, close to the front line, remain offline. Officials say that power generation capacity in the country has now dropped below 20 gigawatts. In mid-May, the national energy company, Ukrenergo, started implementing emergency power rationing across the country. The capital, Kyiv, faces unscheduled blackouts as energy demands are exceeding the permitted limits. Ukrainians may have to endure long stretches without electricity in the coming months due to the Russian attacks. Ukraine's energy minister has already held talks with Brussels in a bid to help keep the lights on when winter returns. Better air defences and greater power supplies from the EU would help.
English has officially become one of the international languages of communication recognized in Ukraine. The move comes after the Ukrainian parliament passed the law on mandatory fluency of English for several state positions, as Kyiv looks to boost its language skills and join the European Union.
According to Euromaidan Press, the Ukrainian parliament has adopted a law that officially establishes English as one of the languages of international communication in Ukraine. Lawmaker Yaroslav Zelenskyy is cited as saying the new law defines the categories of job positions for which candidates must speak English. It also regulates the use of English language in the work of the authorities and in the fields of education, culture and other public spheres. The law passed with 236 politicians in support and 3 voting against the measure. It also included an amendment to provide budget support for cinemas showing English language films in the original language. This was backed by 226 votes.
And now let's go ahead and look at the situation along the front lines in Ukraine. Of course, here we can see the entire length of the current front lines going all the way up to the Kharkiv region, and there could be a storm brewing up there in the Sumy region as Russian forces amass on the other side of that border. But right now we turn our attention to Kharkiv. And in Kharkiv, the Russians have, of course, launched an offensive in the region earlier in May, pushing really strong towards the city of Vovchansk. And in fact, that city has almost been completely decimated or destroyed. Now, one of the biggest developments since last week is the fact that the United States and others have given the green light for Ukraine to go ahead and use Western-supplied weapons and ammunition to strike targets on the other side of the border in the Kharkiv region. That has proven key this week, and in fact, stopping the Russian advances and, according to the Institute for the Study of War, pushing the Russians back in some areas of the city of Vovchansk, especially there in the center of the city. It seems like the Ukrainians, to the best of our knowledge, what we can determine, have at least made some good progress in taking the center of the city. Now, the Russians are still flanking north of Vovchansk and to the south. However, the ability to hit Russian positions on the other side of the border with those Western weapons is making a really big difference. And of course, we are expecting perhaps in the next week, maybe 2, perhaps Ukraine can make the push back and push the Russians out of the area. Little has changed in the area of Kupiansk. However, Russian forces have reportedly made some small advances to the southeast of the city. Now we look at the situation near Chasiv Yar, near Avdiivka. Now, looking at Chasiv Yar, of course, the Russians have reportedly pushed all the way up to the canal area in that city, taken Ivanivsky. They have well taken Bogdanivka, and they are continuing to push west. That situation remains dire. And of course, the southern flank of the city also is difficult. I think the graphics are off a little bit here, but now down near Avdiivka. And this is one thing to highlight here as the Ukrainian forces continue to concentrate on the Kharkiv region. Well, the Russian forces have been taking city after village here in the Avdiivka, west of Avdiivka, and the Ocheredny area. Very important, you see this highway connecting Pokrovsk, Konstantinivka, just 10 kilometers away, you have Russian forces. If they cut that road off, that will be a significant development and could make Ukrainian efforts very difficult in that area, to say the least. Well, we'll be looking at that situation, watching it closely over this week. Now let's move on. And to move on, we're going to show you some images. Recently, of course, there was the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and President Vladimir Zelenskyy going to France, meeting today or on Friday with with President Macron as well as President Joe Biden. So let's take a look at some images from this tour. And now it's time to look at the war in Ukraine through a journalist lens. Joining me now is Piotr Kaszuwara. When he's not reporting from the war zone, he volunteers to help people in need in Ukraine. He reports for onet.pl as well as Radio 357, and he volunteers for Fundacja UA Future. Hello, Piotr. Thanks for joining me this week.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yep. Now, we were talking earlier, you just got back from a trip near Liman, and of course, they're close to the border area in the Kharkiv region. Let's start with Liman. What is the situation looking like there? What were you doing there? What can you tell us?
Situation near Liman is really difficult and is getting worse, unfortunately. Srebrański forest is one of the most dangerous places in whole Ukraine just right now, next to Avdiivka, next to Orychiv, next to Kherson, next to Kupiansk and Vovchansk, north from Kharkiv. These are the most active areas of the war on the Ukrainian front lines. We've been there mostly to help children. Because we had some presents together with us from Caritas in Wrocław to deliver to all the children still living at the front line. And we unfortunately found a lot of these children in many villages on the north of Liman. But about the military situation in the region, we need to say that the biggest problem right now for Ukrainian army are FPV drones. They are very dangerous. It's really hard to escape from this kind of drones, and they are almost everywhere. Some of the soldiers, they told me it looks like they are limitless for Russian army, and unfortunately, they own the sky. If we compare it to the beginning of the conflict, Ukraine was stronger on the air, on the sky, and with drones. And actually, Ukraine developed this kind of attacks to save their own people. But Russians, they learned a lot in last couple of months. and they know how to use anti-drone systems. They have special backpacks. Almost every soldier who is attacking has a special backpack to put the Ukrainian drones down. They also use kamikaze drones, these FPV drones, recognizing drones. They are flying all above the villages. And the biggest problem are aviation bombs, very huge bombs coming from the Second World War. Russians, they are using them a lot. They hit villages. And for example, in Drobyshevo, this is the village where I was many times during our missions, and I never wear bulletproof jacket or helmet. And this time it was really scary, really dangerous, because whole city center was destroyed by these aviation bombs just day before we arrived. And we had this presents for International Children Day for all the kids who are still living there. And if you can imagine, we've been meeting usually with the families in the city center, and this time we called them to say, like, we are here, and they didn't show up because they've been afraid, and we didn't want to go to the village because usually we've been going from house to the house searching for the families, delivering food. And this time we knew that we can be very easy target for these FPV drones, what I just mentioned.
Yeah.
So these are the biggest problems in not only in Donbas but all along the front line.
Right. Yeah, I've heard reports of that. I mean, hearing that more than 80% of the injuries right now are directly related to FPV drones. As comparison to last year, this is a completely different war, and the Russians have caught up. They've adapted, and some people say that they even hold the advantage right now as far as that's concerned. Now, you are also near the north of Kharkiv, near the border region of Russia, just about 10 kilometers away. What was the situation like over there?
It's also pretty hard, especially in Kharkiv itself. Maybe not especially, but Kharkiv, it's the second biggest city in Ukraine. There is still a lot of people living. There is a normal life going on. The restaurants are open, shops are open. You can even go to the swimming pool, for example. You can go to the gym. You can live more or less normal life. And sometimes right now the fire alarms, bomb alerts are long for 8 hours in a day, 9 hours in a day. The longest one was long for 20 hours, and we all know how it ended because the shopping mall epicenter was bombed and a lot of people got killed over there. First time also during this war, I saw Ukrainian aircrafts flying just above my head near the city center, and this is completely crazy. Helicopters, aircrafts, working air defense, for example. It's completely normal view for Kharkiv right now. There was a crazy situation because when this aircraft just flew above my head and started to hit Russian rockets to put them down, I've been just giving a doll, Barbie doll, to the small girl, and she completely didn't realize, which is actually good, what just happened. But anyhow, I think this is also quite scary because all these kids, they stop to be afraid, and that's why they are in the bigger danger to be killed, actually, because they are not hiding. And we saw it near Chuhuyev, for example, when the sirens just started to run. All the kids didn't care about it, and they stay at the playground. Yeah. What about the front line itself? About 15,000 people have been evacuated from the villages near the border, like Vovchansk. The biggest fights are going on now in Liptsi, and this is very dangerous because this village is only about 20 kilometers away from the edge of Kharkiv. And if the Russians will reach this village, they will have Kharkiv in the artillery range.
Yep.
And this is very, very dangerous because Saltivka already know what can happen. If you go near to the border, as we have been in Zolochiv, for example, you can see that the work is going on really hard. Ukrainians, they building trenches, they building other defense lines. And this is also very dangerous for all these people or these companies, because a lot of them are not built by the army, but by the private companies. So I've been talking to one of the men who is doing that near the border, and this is crazy because until Ukraine didn't have power to use the weapon outside of the country on the Russian territory, he told me that all these Russian aircrafts have been, flying just near the border. They've been shooting to Kharkiv and running away, and nobody could do anything. Even air defense, they couldn't shoot them down.
They don't even have to pass into Ukrainian airspace, which makes it very important that these Western weapons are used and they're able to hit where the troops where they are on the other side of the border. Let's hope that this makes a difference. Piotr Kaszuwara from the Fundacja UA Future, also war correspondent. Thank you very much for joining us and describing this situation there in eastern Ukraine. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And Vladimir Putin's gamble to advance on Kharkiv appears, for the moment, to have backfired. The Kremlin's new offensive into the northeastern region has done what months of lobbying from President Vladimir Zelenskyy could not, by securing Western backing to fire advanced weapons at military targets within Russia.
Fierce fighting in the Kharkiv region. Troops here on the front line in Kupiansk describe conditions as worse than hell. They're facing the brunt of Russia's renewed focus on the region. Soldiers in infantry, artillery and drone units all expressed exhaustion. They spoke of an acute shortage of ammunition. Though the US Congress finally greenlit a long-delayed $60 billion military package in April, analysts say that a severe worldwide shortage of artillery shells means Ukraine may be outgunned by Russia for the remainder of the year as Kyiv's allies ramp up production. But one of the biggest boosts to Ukraine's defences may have been provided by President Putin. The Kremlin drive into the northeast border region has seen Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, suffer badly. The push has also prompted Kyiv's NATO backers to approve the use of advanced Western weapons at Moscow's forces across the border in Russia. The result is an onslaught of Ukrainian cross-border strikes that are now ravaging Russian forces operating in the Belgorod region. The Russian operation along the frontier has slowed, with Ukraine's rapid deployment of reserves seemingly having headed off the danger of a significant breakthrough toward Kharkiv.
Of course, we also examined the situation in the north, in the Kharkiv region, and in the border areas of Sumy and the Chernihiv region. I am grateful to each unit, each commander and soldier, thanks to whom it was possible to stabilize the Kharkiv direction.
The commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army, General Alexander Syrsky, has visited operations near Kharkiv and Kupiansk. He said the situation there is difficult. Ukraine's defense ministry said Russian troop losses in May amounted to nearly 40,000, the highest monthly figure since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. It comes as Ukraine's main intelligence directorate suggests that Russia has amassed around 550,000 troops in occupied territories of Ukraine and near its border. Syrsky, who was appointed in February, has to stabilize the situation in order to buy time for Ukraine to rebuild its units. He'll need to make the best use of increasing munition supplies and Kyiv's new long-range firepower, especially if Moscow throws hundreds of thousands more men into its meat grinder war.
And now joining me here on Ukraine This Week is Jon Sweet, retired military intelligence officer. Hello, Jon. Thanks for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Hey, Don, thanks for having me back on the show.
It's great to have you, as always. Now, looking at the situation in Kharkiv, this crucial decision last week by President Biden to allow Ukraine to finally use American weapons and ammunition, although not all of them, to hit areas along the border region in Russia, on the other side of the border, the Kharkiv region. Well, we see two things. We see the Ukrainian forces are able to somewhat stop the advance, and it looks like if they can use these weapons in the right way, they can push the Russians back. But the downside to that is down in the Donbas, and if we look at the situation near Avdiivka or in Chasiv Yar, Russians are continuing to advance in those regions because of the concentration that's shifted up to the Kharkiv region. So what do you do at this point? Do you concentrate on getting the Russians out of those border areas in the Kharkiv region? As our friend, correspondent Piotr Kaszuwara just said, that if they get within firing range of Saltivka in Kharkiv, well, they're going to harass the city completely. So would you concentrate there on Kharkiv before shifting forces down and trying to make some progress there in the Donbas?
Yeah, those are tough questions for military commanders to make as far as where you're going to concentrate your forces and where you deem the biggest threat to be right now. I think Ukraine probably still deems the biggest threat to be in the Kharkiv region as it approaches their second largest city. And like you said, if the Russian forces are advanced a little closer, they'll be able to put the city in artillery range of conventional munitions artillery. I think Ukraine's done a very good job in the Donbas as far as stopping the advancement. But what you're going to see with Russia right now is you're going to see a continuation of offensive probing actions along that defensive front. They're looking for weaknesses. They know that the Ukrainian military is extended. They also know that, as we say in the military, they're a mile wide and an inch deep, so the depth of the defense isn't what Ukraine would like it to be. But they're also very conscious of the ability that Ukraine now has, being able to strike across the border and hit those sanctuary areas that Russia at one time was able to hide their military forces with conventional artillery, but also with to some degree, the HIMARS with the ranges out to about 70 kilometers.
Right, and actually, concerning the HIMARS, recent reports indicate that Russians are doing a really good job at jamming the HIMARS, and they haven't been quite as effective as they were when they were first given to them, right, back in summer of 2022. So what do we do about that? Is there any system that the United States can give Ukrainians that might be able to help in that signal warfare and that jamming, or give them a new system that will replace the HIMARS?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, the battlefield always comes down to an action, reaction, and then a counteraction. The action, obviously, is the introduction of HIMARS. The reaction is how the Russians have adapted to it, either withdrawing their troops beyond the HIMARS range or using electronic warfare to interfere with the guidance systems of the munitions as they're landing. So what's the counteraction? And that's always the question. How do you counteract that? Well, the counteraction is to locate those jamming devices and to put them out of commission is one counteraction. The other is more of an intermix of conventional artillery with the HIMARS and other types of munition capabilities. So it's a constant game of chess. You're constantly maneuvering. You're constantly trying different things. But the enemy is going to react to what you're doing, and then you have to react to that action. So it is a chess match there on the battlefield.
And this decision by President Biden, of essentially President Macron and Chancellor Scholz, to allow Western weapons and ammunition to be used on those border regions up in the Kharkiv region on Russian territory. Well, again, we just talked about that down in Donbas. I mean, the situation, that doesn't help them down in Donbas. It only helps them up there around Kharkiv. So how do we remedy that?
Well, you know, the situation obviously in the Donbas is a closer fight. I'm not sure how do you remedy that, but you do turn and you look at the ammunition that the Czech Republic and France is putting into the country. You look into the additional soldiers that are being brought on the Ukrainian military and put into those fighting positions. You're looking at the introduction of F-16s sometime. We keep hearing in the spring, but now we're into the summer. But the F-16s and a close air support role can provide some release also. Fortunately, the good news, at least for Ukraine, is that Russians are going to come at you with mass. They're going to throw infantry at you. They're going to throw artillery at you. What they have to do is that they have to defeat the Russian artillery so that they can defeat the infantry as they try to close in our position. So artillery is going to be, at least from a ground perspective, Russian artillery and their counter battery capabilities and their radars should be some pretty high value targets that they need to take off the battlefield in order to be successful in their current defensive posture.
Right. Hopefully we can soon field those F-16s, or at least they'll get put in play to make a difference on the battlefield. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin has indicated, well, he's kind of given away the significant losses that Russians are facing on the battlefield. Likely about, I think he indicated around 5,000 deaths per month, around 15,000 additional casualties, so around 20,000 casualties per month. And it seems that Vladimir Putin has, well, no regard for these numbers, and it really doesn't matter. So I guess, what next? Is there another red line that we have to cross again in the West? We've limited the permission to use our weapons just on the border areas. Should we cross that red line and allow them to strike targets deeper in Russia?
So from my perspective, the answer is yes. ATACMS ought to be released in order to hit targets deeper. You heard the president this weekend in an interview with ABC News said he wasn't going to let Ukraine strike targets in Moscow. And quite frankly, Ukraine's not interested in striking targets in Moscow. Ukraine's interested in striking targets that are striking them, whether it's airfields from which MiG-31s are being launched from, or Tu-95s, or if it's ballistic missiles that are being fired from the ground, hitting those launch sites, or hitting the staging areas where Russian troops are assembled and their tanks and their artillery are located. That's where it is. And as long as Russia knows that those extended range munitions can't get to them, they're just going to offset those locations beyond the range of the 70 kilometers that the HIMARS, the general ammunition is being used right now, the Block 1 ammunition is. And they'll stay beyond that range. But they're going to continue to probe. They're looking for weaknesses, and they're going to continue to search, and they're going to continue to try to attack. I believe one of the articles that I read earlier, there's 25 to 40 attacks a day that are going on, even more. And the numbers that Putin has given are somewhat low. I mean, I think that the count that the Ministry of Defense has given us is upwards of 515,000 casualties on the Russian side. But, Great Britain, the United Kingdom intelligence is telling us that Russia is losing upwards to 1,000 a day. So there will be no change in tactics. It's going to be mass. It's going to be volume. It's going to be infantry. It's going to be bombings. That's what it is. And he's going to be relentless with it because Putin thinks he can drive the West to a negotiated solution. And Zelenskyy is not going to do that.
Yeah. Words of wisdom. Well, Jon Sweet, retired military intelligence officer, thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
I'm back on the show.
The Kremlin has escalated its rhetoric in the wake of NATO countries' approval for Kyiv to use Western-supplied weapons and ammunition to strike limited targets on Russian territory. Although the green light has only been given for the regions directly bordering Ukraine, the Kremlin has expressed outrage, saying that another escalation by NATO and that it will arm the West's enemies in retaliation.
Both Washington and Berlin have authorized Ukraine to hit some targets on Russian soil with the long-range weapons they're supplying. It's a significant policy change that comes as depleted Ukrainian troops are losing ground in the war. The Institute for the Study of War reports that Ukrainian forces struck a Russian S-300-400 air defense battery in the Belgorod region, likely with HIMARS, last weekend. In an exclusive interview with ABC's World News Tonight anchor David Muir, US President Joe Biden emphasized that the US weapons will not be used to strike Moscow.
They're authorized to be used in proximity to the border when they're being used on the other side of the border to attack specific targets in Ukraine. We're not authorizing strikes 200 miles into Russia. We're not authorizing strikes on Moscow, on the Kremlin.
Russia's President Vladimir Putin recently met with his Belarusian counterpart Alexander Lukashenko to discuss exercises with tactical nuclear weapons. And Putin warned Germany that the use of its weapons by Ukraine to strike inside Russia was a dangerous step. He said Moscow could, in turn, provide long-range arms to others to strike Western targets. Analysts say the Kremlin is trying to impede any Western resolve in allowing long-distance Ukrainian strikes on military targets within Russia in order to avoid destabilizing its energy infrastructure and disrupting the lives of everyday Russians. They say Moscow is using the fear of escalation and nuclear saber-rattling to inflame worries within Western populations of a possible widening of the conflict. Russia sees each sign of discord in the Western coalition supporting Ukraine as a strategic opportunity, and the ongoing disagreements about using granted weapon systems for long-distance strikes inside Russian territory are perceived as particularly rich. Ukrainian troops welcome the change in policy, saying the weapons will only be used to strike military targets, not civilians. If the Western stance changed further, allowing preemptive attacks in Russia, Ukrainian forces would no longer be fighting with one hide tied behind their backs.
And now I'd like to welcome Rostyslav Khotin, senior editor at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Ukrainian service. Hello, and thanks for joining me on Ukraine This Week.
Hello.
Now, concerning the use of these Western weapons, finally, as we've had in our previous discussion, again, we're going to have with you the situation about striking Russian territory. Is this a little, well, too less and too late, in your opinion, concerning this decision? Should the West be starting to think about targets that are, say, as Joe Biden didn't say, I don't know, 200-300 kilometers into Russian territory to be able to affect the situation on the front line?
Ukraine had been asking this permission for quite a long time, but at last it was granted. Some Western countries, Western partners of Ukraine, had no problems whatsoever, even before, to give this right for Ukraine to strike military targets on Russian soil. But the main obstacles were position of the United States and Germany, leading NATO members. Germans hesitated because Americans hesitated. But then the go-ahead green light came from Washington, and now Berlin followed this approach, and also Germany has no problems with Ukraine striking Russian military targets on Russian soil with German weapons, German-supplied weapons. Although these strikes will be limited to regions bordering Ukrainian region, Kharkiv region of Ukraine, in this northeast of the country. So Ukraine could strike, for instance, Belgorod region of Russia, or Kursk, or other regions which are in the close proximity to Kharkiv region of Ukraine. And also Ukraine couldn't strike very deep into Russian territory. Like 200 miles, Americans gave permission for 200 miles. It's about 320 kilometers. And Ukraine, as President Biden said, cannot strike Moscow, of course, and the Kremlin in Russia. Also these strikes will be limited only to military targets, from where Russia is striking Ukraine with drones, with missiles, with airfields where guided bombs are launched by bombers, and where these bombers are taking off. So also this Ukraine cannot strike whatever it wants. It should strike only those military bases, military facilities which pose threat to Ukraine, especially when Kharkiv is threatened by shelling from the Russian side.
Right, right. Well, I mean, obviously, it looks like it's going to help in the Kharkiv region. It already is helping in the Kharkiv region. So, I mean, that's a good thing. It's in line with international law and Ukraine's right to defend itself, another good thing. But also last week, I was surprised to see that when Vladimir Zelenskyy gave an interview, I believe it was to The Guardian, that even the United Kingdom, we were all under the impression that the United Kingdom said, go ahead and use these weapons on Russian territory without any restrictions. And it seems like those storm shadows were not on that list. Most likely that has got to be a red line that has to be crossed, because I don't know what the solution would be in, say, the Donbas, right? We see the Ukrainian forces pushing back the Russians in the Kharkiv region, Vovchansk and the border areas there. But down in the Donbas, the situation isn't looking very pretty. How do you think that that situation could be affected?
Yeah, this Russian sudden incursion into Kharkiv region in early May caught Ukraine by surprise, to be honest. And it's distracted Ukraine from eastern parts of the country, from Donbas region. Because Ukrainian attention was concentrated in the east on the Donbas, and also in the south of occupied parts of Kherson region and Zaporizhia region. So this Kharkiv incursion by Russian troops caught Ukraine by surprise. It was sudden, unexpected. That's why Ukrainians' attention was sort of switched suddenly to Kharkiv region, and Ukrainian forces were overstretched, of course, because the line is the front line is quite long, and also the thing it was with this Kharkiv incursion that Russia launches artillery strikes from its territory, missiles from its territory, drones from its territory. So for Ukraine, it was difficult to get to the point, let's say, to the source. So let's say, yes. But in the Donbas, meanwhile, situation is all very difficult. While the Ukraine is pushing back in the Kharkiv region, in the Donbas, Ukraine is losing village after village, slowly but gradually. Unfortunately, village after village, Russian troops occupied. It's not significant territorial gains for Russia, but nevertheless, Ukrainian troops on a slight retreat, slow retreat, and losing small settlements, small villages after villages. But not to the significant degree.
Yeah, right. Well, it seems that even experts are saying that they're within about 10 kilometers or so of the road, that connects Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk. If they get to that road, if they cut that road off, do you think that would be a significant development?
Yeah, I mean, Russian strategic aim in the Donbas remains the same. They want, by the end of the year, to get to the administrative borders of Donetsk region and Luhansk region, to extend the so-called, the statelets, this kind of republics, so-called republics, Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, to the administrative border of Donetsk and Luhansk region. In Luhansk, they are closer to this aim because most of the Luhansk region is occupied by Russian troops. But in Donetsk, situation is kind of still lot of
being decided.
Yeah, still undecided. Yes. And also Kharkiv for them was important as a Ukraine psychology city. Psychologically, it's very important. Russia wants to kind of the only regional center of Ukraine, apart from Donetsk and Luhansk, which was occupied by the Russian troops, was Kherson in the south. The only regional center which was occupied during this Russian invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, full-scale aggression. But Kherson was liberated. So Russia thought that Kharkiv is nearby, like a prize for them, especially when Kharkiv is just 35 kilometers from the Russian border. And they thought that, one more regional city for a grab, but it wasn't like that. It was a difficult task for them, and Ukrainians strike back. So Kharkiv also has a psychological dimension because it's where the Soviet rule in Ukraine was established, spread from Kharkiv region. It was the capital of Soviet Ukraine for a long time at the beginning, when Kyiv was kind of Soviet Russia, Bolshevik Russia didn't trust Kyiv. They moved capital to Kharkiv, And from Kharkiv, this expansion of the Moscow rule expanded to all Ukraine more than 100 years ago. So that's why Kharkiv was extremely important for Russians from military point of view, from logistical point of view, from psychological point of view, and for political point of view.
Well, Rostislav, they didn't take it in 2022, and they're not going to take it in 2024. Rostyslav Khotin, thank you very much. Senior editor, RFE/RL's Ukrainian service, thank you very much for joining me today on Ukraine This Week.
Thank you.
And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. If you ever miss us, please check us out on our YouTube channel on TVP World. See you next week, and thanks for watching.